goated with the sauce, the Yammock sauce. It's Southpaw Deep Space 9. Hey everybody, this is the show where I, Angel Marti, guide your friend of mine, Southpaw Sam, into the journey of Star Trek fandom by watching episode by episode Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the most communist Star Trek show. And he and I discuss the different messages, morals, implications, political and cultural, overt and implicit, of each episode. Sam, how are you doing?
Oh, better than some, not as good as some. It's okay.
I'm now the goal of that of asking how are you, like at the beginning of every episode, is not to actually like get an answer, but just to see what new creative deflection you can come up with. So thank you for that new creative exercise on my end.
Wait. How are you?
Let's see. I am maintaining my solid state and not dissipating into a cloud of protoplasm, so could be better. I mean, could be worse. Maybe I do want to be protoplasm. Maybe that was a Freudian slip. I'm actually doing pretty good. I'm doing this on like a full night's sleep. So even though I wasn't super enamored with this episode, I didn't hate it as much as I hated Battle Lines. But speaking of this episode, so it is episode 14, season 1, Progress. I always want to say it like that. Progress. So we open on the B plot, which is basically we sort of got this in the B plot of storytellers as well. It just seems like the writers at this point of the season really want to pick Jake and Nog to be like the little rascals in space, because they're like playing cards in Quark's bar after hours, and they're like, or it's kind of like, it is perfectly like Ed, and Eddie. They're just like bored kids living in the suburbs looking for a scheme to pass the time. If anybody ever watched that show. But so they overhear Quark berating, they didn't name him in the episode, but he's Broik, one of the other Ferengi workers in the bar, having over-ordered on Cardassian Yammock sauce, which apparently is something that only the Cardassians can stomach, and now that they're no longer on the station, it's just a bunch of useless inventory taking up space. So it's like Vegemite, basically. But Nog gets the idea to flip this Yammock sauce into money and drags Jake into it. He describes the idea by saying that his lobes are tingling, and when a lobe tingles, it means only one thing: opportunity. And at this point in the season, we know pretty well that like stimulating a Ferengi's earlobes is basically erotic. But we cut to the main plot of this episode, which is we get in the captain's log, which is, by the way, I've always said this about Star Trek in general, that like the captain's log is such a great device to just get away with exposition and to do it in a way that makes sense. So I always like having those at the beginning of episodes. We learn that Bajor is finally growing into more of a mature interstellar planet state because it's going to start extracting resources from the environment. It's about to tap into the molten core, of one of its moons, Gerardo. And Cisco and the DS9 crew are helping oversee this tapping. The on board the station to help them oversee it is Minister Turan, who's like sort of a Basil Fawlty type character, just this annoying persnickety bureaucrat who seems to specifically be there just to anger Kira. And just one scene of them together, Kira's just like, I'm going to leave to inspect. So Kira and Dax leave on a runabout to inspect this moon that's about to be tapped. They find a humanoid presence is on this moon, and even though all the inhabitants were supposed to evacuate. So Kira beams down to investigate. When they beam down, first thing I notice is that the backdrop looks a lot like the village from last week's episode. But that's kind of mean of me to point that out, because come on, TV is expensive. Reuse what you have. But the more important thing is that as soon as she materializes she is greeted by angry farm implement wielding colonists. Cut to the main titles. The only reason we don't hear banjos playing is because sound waves don't propagate through the vacuum of space. But the leader of the angry farmers comes out of his hut. He basically, this happens a lot when I watch 90s television, or at least when I watch Star Trek, is that sometimes it feels like the guest star du jour feels like a more affordable version of some more famous type. And in this case, it's like this guy feels like affordable for TV Kirk Douglas, like that kind of like, he has sort of a similar facial shape, the kind of like grizzled old dude. He comes out and sort of calls the other two off, explaining that they just don't like uniforms. And for some reason, even though these are Bajorans, they're like Bajorans from Kansas or something, because they have this like vaguely Midwestern, Southern, basically like these farmer accents. And they very much are these stereotypical pig-headed homesteaders who won't be moved away, even when they're going to be melted by a goddamn molten core being tapped. But because they are so folksy, they will invite Kira in for supper. And Kira, because she just has no... will obey any Bajoran telling her to do something folksy, goes inside. So we cut back to the station, and Jake and Nog, on this week's caper, run into this week's example of, hey, this show can afford more than just foreheads now, because we see this Lysepian who has like an elaborate like head prosthetic and chin piece and stuff, which I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say this was probably stimulated by Babylon 5 having more complex alien makeup. I will credit anything good about Star Trek Deep Space Nine to having to, it was like the Monday Night Wars. WWF was only good because it had to compete against WCW. But so they run into this Lysepian cargo runner who does a lot of dealings with the Cardassians. And I'm like, hey, you can sell off this Yamak sauce. And I guess the advantage of interstellar trade is that if you're dealing with somebody from another species, they can't assume that you are of an adolescent age from how you look, because this dude just immediately takes this like teenage human and Ferengi seriously. But instead of offering to pay in Latinum, which was Nog's intended goal, he wants to do a trade. He wants to trade the Yamak sauce for 100 gross of self-sealing stem bolts. And while Nog wants to press just for Latinum, Jake convinces him that the greatest value these stem bolts have is being able to advance the B-plot, so they agree to the trade. Back on the moon, basically the whole... So this guy, this old farmer dude, his whole thesis seems to be he's going to be condescending and sexist to Kira, but for some reason, because he's old, it's charming somehow. Like he talks about like how he'll tell Kira like that you look even prettier in this light, and she just kind of shrugs it off. We get some of the backstory. The older dude has been there for 40 years, and then the two younger people with him have been there for 18 years, and neither of them speak because they suffered some unspeakable violation from the Cardassians. It turns out that before they were able to escape the occupation, the Cardassians surgically removed their SAG cards, so that's why they can't speak on camera, at least. No, apparently they've been mutilated somehow. I guess it just was easier that way. What if it was like if maybe they were like, we need more characters in this episode, and then the writer was like, I'm not going to write more dialogue for them, I'm too tired. And this was just their compromise. So Kira eventually she realizes that the whole like being a sexist douchebag is apparently a purposeful bit to try and get her to leave them alone and just purposefully like repulse her. But after having been around Bashir this long, we know that it's going to take a lot more than that to get rid of Kira. There's an interesting bit where, like, when Kira basically like says, like, okay, I know you're trying to, like, just be an asshole to get rid of me, so let's cut the bullshit and, like, be a little bit more direct with each other. And we learn that this guy's name is Mullabach, and he asks Kira for her name. But he then says, when she says, "I'm Major Kira," he then says, "Your given name," and she says, her given name's Nerys. And Sam, I think we may have talked about this before, but remind me, did we discuss how Bajoran names are ordered much like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean surnames, where the surname comes first?
No, I don't think you mentioned it.
Yeah, no, this is, I think it was mentioned briefly in the emissary, but maybe we didn't talk about it in our episode. But yeah, so Kira is her surname, and so Nerys is her first name. And we'll learn as we get further into the show, like, more characters that are, like, close to her will address her as Nerys. And then we learn that her mother's name is Kira Maru, etc. So I find this, I want to know, like, I'll let you speak on your reaction to that, as far as, like, oh no, they have to Asianize the aliens even more, or not, or whatever your feelings are about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that a lot, about how to make somebody alien in space, you just make them more Asiatic. So it fits.
Again, Babylon 5 was able to make the Centauri, who are basically like Napoleonic French/Roman Empire, so it is possible. So, what's interesting here is that, like, my first reaction to how Kira is so, like, immediately indulgent to Mullabach it almost feels like, even though they're the same race, they're all Bajorans, it feels like a white guilt type of reaction. Like, that she's in this situation where these people are, like, more oppressed, or I guess more. I mean, yeah, she is on. We get to more explicit discussion of this later, but, like, now she's the one in a situation of having to exert power, and her reaction to that is to just sort of, react overly indulgently to make up for her own guilt about it. But then finally, after some more, like, folksy, like, eating simple farmer food, she finally lays it down straight that the moon's core is going to get tapped. Oh, yeah, in 7 days. And they're just, Mullabach and his two silent friends, are just 3 people holding up a project that is going to benefit thousands of other Bajorans. Earlier in the episode, the minister says, like, specifically, like, the energy that they're going to tap from this moon is going to warm, thousands of Bajoran homes during the winter. Which they again, like, winter on what part of the planet? But that's, we've already talked about that over monolithizing cultures that take up an entire planet. But whatever. What the winter, the planet-wide winter.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, as well as our private chat group on Discord. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
There's a cool line here that basically Kira's telling them, you can just move back to Bajor now, and they seem to be a little bit too hesitant. And there's a good line here where Kira says, what we're trying to create now, i.e., Bajor post-occupation, is what you weren't allowed to have then. And which it's like we sort of get this theme of, like, it's not just, like, Kira's discomfort with being in a position of power, but also this sort of, like, generational trauma and communicating across generational lines. And but Mullabach is not convinced. He says he can't really. His home is on this moon, and he can't just simply return to Bajor and have as fulfilling a life as he has.
The theme seems to be the transition from colonialism to neoliberalism, which has actually come up in previous episodes, where Kira is questioning what she's doing. Is it the right thing? And she comes off as the reformer who's like, well, somebody needs to do this, right? And so it's touching on that theme again where, okay, here's progress, but at what cost? What does it cost to play with the big boys? And then who do you have to collaborate with to play with the big boys? And what are the things you have to extract and do on your own country to do these things?
Yeah, yeah. Once we got to this point of the series, of the episode, it actually made me start thinking about. There's a Chinese film by director Jia Zhangke. It was released in 2006. It's called Still Life, and it's in Chinese name is Sanxia Haoren, and it's about a coal miner who returns to his hometown only to find that it's basically been flooded because of construction of the Three Gorges Dam, like an actual dam that was built in China. And so that idea of like, the rural life having to suffer in the name of like uh, technological progress for the sake of more resources, more fuel, more energy, but done in space as always. But before we can further meditate on that, we go back to the station where Nog goes back to Quarks because they need to actually access the Yamak sauce to trade for these stem bolts. And through some dialogue, we learn that Ferengi have no qualms about child labor because apparently Nog has been doing a lot of jobs around the bar. But he basically, this is almost like a non-conflict because he just tells Quark, hey, I'm going to take the Yamak sauce to the matter reclamation unit because you clearly don't want it. And Quark's just like, okay, do anything with it. But then we cut back to Green Acres and we hear more about Mullibok's original escape from the Cardassian labor camp. He's telling a sort of a long, rambling story to Kira about stowing away on a Cardassian ship that landed on this moon, Gerardo. And he then overpowered 6 crew members on the ship and then survived starvation through sheer willpower. Like, he's basically the Bjorn Steven Seagal. It's just like telling stories that he knows are BS, but like, who cares? And Kira, though, because, one thing we'll say about Kira is that even if she is riddled with guilt, she never has a broken BS detector. So she's listening along kind of like the granddaughter at Thanksgiving who listens to a grandpa's story that she knows is bullshit. And, indulges it out of pity for the fact that, he has the terminal disease of old. But then he starts asking Kira about her life. Mullibok's asking, like, what it was like to fight in the resistance. And he sort of flippantly says that he's sorry he missed the fun. And then Kira gets a little bit riled up about, what do you mean fun? But then we get to this interesting point where, so Mullibok basically asks, like, you had no chance. Everybody probably thought you had no chance. Why did you end up winning, at all? And then she says, because we hung on like fanatics. And so we're starting to see this, that Mullibok's trying to get her to understand that he knows that this is like a hopeless cause, but it seems like the principle of the thing, and probably just the fact that he's already old, he has no reason to not just hang on to the one bit of stability and familiarity he's gotten to. But then Kira responds by saying that, once they tap the core, the atmosphere is going to be filled with carbon and sulfur compounds. But Mullibok's like, I'll figure it out. He basically thinks that you can like fight a protracted people's war against air itself.
Yeah, his motivation was, it's one of those things about this episode, right? It's not very clear, but one thing I did like is Mullibok compares the provisional government and the Federation to the Cardassians. And this is a interesting point because the thing they have in common is extraction, right? They both were doing this to extract resources to gain more power. So based on that, another point I want to make is about energy, which is important to understand for even geopolitical understanding in real life. Energy is power, not only in a world without universal currency, but also we're reminded of that now with oil and natural gas prices. Those who control energy and extract energy and can control both have power.
Yeah, no, it is interesting that like we kind of have this same kind of dynamic going on at both the intraplanetary level and then also the broader sort of interplanetary level with the whole like control of the Bajoran wormhole as, access to travel routes.
Well, I think it's also just reminding us what's at play and what is important in worldcraft. And one is energy. And to your point about wormhole is an analog to on Earth controlling the waterways, the shipping lanes and the travel lanes, which is why the US has by far the biggest navy and why they have to have the biggest navy because they want to control all the waterways. And that's part of how they have power.
Right. So Kira finally just accepts that that Mullibok's just going to stay there and die, and she'll relay his curmudgeonly sass as an official response. So we get back to the station, and Jake and Nog now have their stem bolts. And I remember, I think during one of the last, during the B plot of the Storyteller, I think I already made reference to this feeling like little rascals. And then what really seals this feeling like a early 20th century, like little, comedic short is that, before I made comparisons to Odo being like the Irish cop coming to box their ears and, send them back to school. But this time the one who comes in is O'Brien. So it's even more perfect. Except instead of being like, well, now what's all this then? He's just like, well, he basically does say that, but he's just like, I don't even know what all this is then. He's like saying, what do you need these self-sealing stem bolts for? I don't even know what they're for. And then so even though because O'Brien's not a fucking cop, he does leave them alone after just messing with them a little bit. But it does render the problem that Jake and Nog don't even know what the hell a self-sealing stem bolt is for. So how are they going to sell merchandise that they can't even explain the use of?
So this made me just think about why can't they just ask the computer what the self-sealing stem bolts do, right?
That's true. I didn't even think of that.
Throughout the Next Generation and DS9, they're constantly asking the computer, tell me this, tell me that.
You're absolutely right.
Except all of a sudden, in this episode, computers don't exist. To your point about Little Rascals, they're also going back to like Little Rascals technology, right? The same type of lack of technology problems they had in their day. How do we figure stuff out?
How did I not notice that? How did I not notice that? Somehow I was so, the establishment of that vibe was just so fully, like it didn't even think, yeah, they were just like even in the Next Generation, they were just like, hey, computer, tell me what the fuck Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra is. And that was like the one thing that stumped a fucking Starfleet computer because it was a pure metaphor, but it still was able to give them something useful. Wow, okay. Well, speaking of deficient technology, Kira comes back to the station to tell Minister Turan and Sisko that Mullibok, the stubborn old coot, will not leave. However, Minister Turan says he won't postpone the tapping, and refuses to let the holdouts hold them out. So he supposes they should just beam nap them off the surface, just forcefully beam them up. But then Kira says that would mean they were acting like the Cardassians. Ooh, she just called him a Bajoran capo. But then Turan says, threatens to take her off this assignment. And, if you can't complete this, I'll find somebody else. But Kira says that won't be necessary. She gets back in line. So she goes straight back to the moon with two security grunts with the intent to just gather up all of their shit and move them off by force if necessary. So Mullibok comes out and confronts Kira, and Kira is saying that she's doing what she has to do, and he says, well, so am I. And apparently what needs to be done is spinning a folksy yarn, which he does kind of spend a lot of this episode doing. I didn't even remember what he was actually. He just has some sort of long monologue. But then the two security grunts come back with the two silent people, and apparently one of them stuck one of the security grunts like a pig, and he's bleeding. But then seeing that Mullibok just goes full Kirk Douglas and charges the grunts, basically committing suicide by space cop because he gets shot. Although he's not totally dead yet because Kira feels his pulse and then tells them to summon Dr. Bashir. So back on the station, in the next stage of this whole business, little old lady who swallowed a fly, Jake and Nog are calling the. So I forgot to mention the stem bolts were bought off of the trader because the person who originally ordered the stem bolts from the trader was a Bajoran dude who couldn't pay for them. And so now they are calling the original Bajoran dude who ordered the stem bolts, but they're using some device to like disguise their voice and their image. Even though like the trader dude was perfectly fine with doing business with them just the way they looked and sounded. So whatever. This is basically an excuse for them to pull the space equivalent of the three kids in a trench coat gag. Jake and Nog refer to themselves as the No J Consortium, which is them being Vincent Adultman, BoJack Horseman reference for anybody who doesn't get it. But the Bajoran dude says he doesn't have any like latinum to pay for it, but he offers to trade them for a piece of land, which almost to me sounded like one of those Facebook grift ads for like become a lord in Scotland or whatever. But Nog just wants the latinum, but Jake insists that they take the deal because I think it sucks that it took until the 24th century, but it's nice to finally see a black man get his 7 tessipates and a mule.
It's funny how the writers are purposely making fun of land when we live in a world where land is the pinnacle asset. And I guess that's the joke, right? The obsession over real estate, which we have to remember at this time was really heating up, which led to the financial crisis a few years later.
Real estate speculation was also causing a similar crisis in other countries. If we remember, Frieza from Dragon Ball Z was modeled on a real estate speculator, per the words of Akira Toriyama.
To tie it back to today, the things that happened in 08, 09, we really never recovered from. People think we did, but part of today's problems is because of the ramifications of the monetary things they did back then.
I kept feeling like, why is it that Nog, it felt out of character to me that Nog would not see the value in property. And I'm just going to chalk that up to Nog being young, because especially in the Nagus, we know that Ferengi have, a very strong concept of location, because, the Grand Nagus says that the bar because of its location was the real source of being able to gain economic power. So we're not going to credit this to any kind of weird cultural ignorance. So we go back to the moon. Mullibok's alive, and we have a brief battle between him and Dr. Bashir as a collision of the forces of Horny and Grumpy, but it's brief. So the two silent ones, Beltram and Kina, who I only even remember their names after they're finally gone from the episode, they've already been taken to Bajor, and Bashir says he should take him to Deep Space Nine for treatment, but Mullibok says no. Bashir, frustrated, goes outside to where Kira is and unsurprisingly expresses willingness to violate an expressed boundary and take him to Deep Space Nine anyway, but Kira also says no.
If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
At this point, we see that Kira starts to she takes off her uniform jacket and just starts helping build part of Mullibok's like this oven barbecue tandoor thing in his front yard. So we cut immediately to Bashir being back on the station telling Cisco about this, and he's really angry, but doesn't want. But he doesn't want to immediately just punish Kira, so he tells Bashir to cover for her by filing an official medical request that Kira remain on the moon for humanitarian reasons. And the cuts between we spend a lot as we get further into the episode. The cuts between the two plots become fewer and fewer. So we go immediately back to Mullibok and Kira on the moon as Kira is sort of nursing Mullibok back to health, and Kira now spins a yarn talking about how when she was young there was a big old tree that in her front yard that had dug itself so deep into the soil that nothing else could grow in the spot where it was, and had grown there so long that it was an obstruction, and it was a big, selfish, annoying, nasty old tree. And Mullibok seems to appreciate the comparison, but at this point, Cisco then calls Kira, having arrived on a runabout himself, and he's gonna beam down. And what I notice here is that Mullibok's immediate response to Cisco being present and gonna beam down is he doesn't have much faith in you, does he? Like immediately jumping to sowing seeds of doubt, which actually I was just reading Memory Alpha, and I think this is a good point to bring up that apparently the writer's original intent for Mullibok was to be a lot less of a sympathetic character and to be a little bit more expressly manipulative. And it was just sort of the performance of this actor ended up imbuing him with more of a charming, sympathetic nature than was originally intended. But this line, I think, has the original intent much more clear. But Cisco arrives. He very cleverly bypasses having to fight with Mullibok because Cisco seems to know what kind of time can be wasted by just engaging with an older white man who just wants to be surly at you. He just frames it as his presence is just being out of concern for Kira, jeopardizing her career. So they are able to go off and just talk to each other. And Cisco finally highlights what we've been sort of feeling subtextually here, that he appreciates and understands how she automatically sympathizes with the underdog, but she has to understand and accept that she is now on the other side of the power dynamic. She's no longer the one resisting against, power and force, but she is the one who was unfortunately in a position that has to enforce somebody else's will on somebody else against their wishes. And there's a nice moment of vulnerability between Kira and Cisco here, because Kira, very directly just says, it feels awful. And Kira and Cisco, interestingly, he goes straight to saying that he likes Kira. He says, originally I thought you were hostile and arrogant, but I know that's not the case. And that I like you and I need you and you have a life ahead of you, more so than this stubborn old dude. And then he just leaves to let Kira figure it out. I thought that was an interesting choice to frame it, not so much in it's not like the mechanics of the power being used here are not to the same oppressive ends as the Cardassians were, but more just, hey, on an interpersonal level, you individually are a good person, and that should absolve you of the guilt that you feel right now. We then have another scene where Kira is nursing Mullibok as he's asleep and overhears him, having a nightmare about memories from his labor camp. Like Kira at this point is like very full of familial affection for him. So we cut back to Jake and Nog are playing cards again, and Nog is just very unhappy about the fact that they now have just some land that apparently to him is useless. And I just kept thinking, like, come on, Nog, just invent the concept of Airbnb for Ferengi, and you're going to be the fucking king of the Ferengi economy. Come on.
It's interesting that they made Jake, the human, the better businessman than Nog. But humans did invent capitalism after all. But essentially, Nog and Jake are the Yankee traders Data warned us about.
Yeah, so finally, interesting in this episode, Odo's the one who comes with presenting an opportunity instead of squashing the fun, because Odo's in the bar talking to Quark about trying to figure out who the No J Consortium are, because there's a Bajoran government official who's contacted him looking to build on the parcel of land that happened to serendipitously be the parcel of land that Nog and Jay now own. So Odo originally suspects that Quark is involved, and that's why he's talking to Quark, but Quark is angry that he's not. After Odo leaves, Quark decides to try and use his magical hacker electronic Kino machine in the bar to find out who these people are, but Nog comes straight to him to admit it and say that he'll sell Quark the land for 5 bars of gold pressed platinum. So finally we reach the goal here. It all comes back to just extorting your uncle for money. I guess that's how things work. That's the moral we learn about how all good business deals should end. But we get back to, it's the new morning on Gerardo. Mullibok is out of bed. He's continuing to build his sort of furnace oven thing. That just sort of, that's been the little bit of visual business in a lot of the scenes he's been in over this whole episode, and it's finally finished. Kira decides she is going to leave and go back to her job, but gives Mullibok an ultimatum that it's like, either leave or you're gonna freaking die. But he says, as long as that cottage is standing, I stay here. And Kira responds by setting the fucking cottage on fire, which, moral implications aside, I'm just like, the teenager brain in me is just like, yeah, fire, hardcore, awesome. But she says, kind of poignantly, it's time to move on with our lives, both yours and mine, sort of harping on this thing that, Kira's reaction. Mullibok, of course, is stuck in having to live this particular life that he's built for himself. And Kira's reaction to Mullibok has been her being stuck in, her life that she had during the occupation and almost wanting to return to that dynamic. But I like, I like that the show ends. It cuts to the credits right as they beam off the planet, and we don't really see any kind of specific thing about what happens to Mullibok. And I sort of like that as a nice little dramatic. It almost feels like sort of stage theater-y, that the lights fade to black like right before we even get the definitive resolution of the plot, before we see any definitive consequences of what's happened in the show.
So I have mixed feelings about the ending, because the ending, as you mentioned, was real abrupt for both the A and B plot. We saw good characters in Kira and Jake act in ways that we wouldn't say was good. But I think that's the point of this episode, that the path of progress requires harm, or that you have to do some bad things for the greater good. Neither of which I agree with, but with the abrupt ending, the show doesn't really take a stance that those are good arguments either, right? It just says those are arguments people make. We're not saying those are good arguments. We're just going to end it here, which I appreciate. But still, it just sort of ended, which felt less artistic and more just lazy. Because up until then, I really enjoyed the episode, especially the guest performance by Brian Keith, who was a really well-known actor in his day. I think his most famous role was in the original Parent Trap, and he did a whole lot of Westerns.
And here I am just dismissing him as budget Kirk Douglas. I'm a Philistine.
And so the episode brought up some really interesting moral questions where I was like, DS9, you're really going to go there? And just when I was curious to see how they would make this all make sense, it ended. It's as if they asked questions and had characters do things they didn't know how to address or explain. Like Kira burns down everything a person cares about and cherishes, then kidnaps him. Jake pursues trickery and profit and is really good at it. The end. I remember the anime series Samurai Champloo. So it had an episode where the main characters died. But then the next episode, everything was back to normal. And the director said he did it to make fun of episodics. Simpsons do this all the time, that same parody, right? Because the joke is that I get to reset next episode. Even old cartoons would make fun of how episodic TV shows at the time relied on that storytelling convention. That's how they got away with certain endings because it relies on the next episode to reset back to the status quo. So I feel like this is an episode where the writers did a great job and then fumbled at the finish line.
I feel like the main problem with the A plot, though, was that it just felt like a lot of the scenes were between Kira and Molobok were kind of repetitive. Like there was, and obviously Brian Keith, very charming and I could watch. I mean, and my mom's side of the family is from Tennessee. I definitely have many familiar experiences with, old men who like to just tell long rambling stories that are probably all lies. And I could watch that, but I just felt like they could have spent more time, addressing the moral ambiguities of it, like maybe spend more time on, how Kira, and Cisco just sort of suss out, the conflict of responsibility with guilt. But I think this almost sort of summarizes the challenge of Star Trek being a piece of pop culture working within, corporate capitalist entertainment that still tries to convey some, messages or philosophical inspections that challenge the dominant ideology, and that there's only going to be so much room in which they can pursue those messages before they have to then pump the brakes before it gets truly threatening.
Kira needed to tell Molobok, this is no country for old men.
Well done, Sam. Well done. Well, if you liked our discussion of Progress, then stay tuned for next week when we go into DS9 episode 1/16. If wishes were horses, that promises some silliness, I think. If you like this episode and you like the show in general, also, you can support us by going to patreon.com/southpawpod. And for as little as $4 a month, you can join our Discord and you can become part of the lovely Southpaw community and support all the different shows in the Southpaw network, like this one, Southpaw Prime. It's not the actual name, that's just what I call it, but Fight Study, Pride Never Die, which is mixed martial arts from an LGBTQ perspective, and also Working Stiff Radio, which covers professional wrestling. And, there's always more content that we solicit from our community members, like alternative commentaries. There's just a lot of stuff going on. We talk about food too. There's a great Southpaw episode about Filipino food. This whole network contains multitudes. If you want more info, you have eyes, read the show notes. Sam spends a lot of time writing those. Don't ignore them. Until next time. Bum, 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 bum.